Strangely, we're all seeing
Good evening.
Good evening.
Welcome. I'm Ann Eichinger. I'm the pastor here at Central, and we are glad to have you all here for our first lecture series in this year. I will get rid of the buzz. I know we just installed a whole new sound system, so I don't know what's going on back there. I'm lucky to make anything work. But it's at least working, and that's a good thing. Most important things, where are bathrooms? Bathrooms are down this hall to your left. The first door on your left is men's. The second one is women's. We're glad to have you here, and Martin, all yours.
Well, I'm glad to see many out. Our advertising had some issues with this, so I'm very happy that word got out in various corners to get you here. I also noticed that as any poetry event, with the terror of the poet, many of you have scattered to the four winds. I understand. I'm afraid of her too. So that's the way this is going to work. My name is Martin Dotterwhite. For those of you who don't know me, I direct the King Institute for Faith and Culture. It was founded as the Baumgaertner Institute for Faith and Culture. And that's particularly timely right now as Baumgaertner died last week at the age of 96. We're going to be commemorating him in the King Alumni Magazine next month. I've just recruited another author for that. And we have a long and warm relationship with Fred's family and with Fred himself. And so it's a sad moment, but also a moment to reflect on and be grateful for his legacy. In fact, if you, at the end, are perusing the books that are on offer, I don't know if he's here or not. The original foreword to this book, The Flannery O'Connor, A Proper Scaring by Jill, has a foreword by Fred Baumgaertner.
Oh.
So he had contributed to that. We are now the King Institute for Faith and Culture. We still do have a Baumgaertner lecture every year, and we hold various events throughout the academic year, fall and spring, to try to illustrate various ways in which Christian faith and culture intersect in a dynamic and interesting way. I try to find things for the programming that are a little oblique. I will never go for things that people shout at each other about. I like instead to find things that we can all learn together. And what better way to find an oblique angle than a poet to start off this year. I will say we are waiting. I have two people who, for very good reasons, are holding off a little bit on committing for me for this fall. So our brochure is still pending. I will tell you that our next event is September 12th. It will be our Appalachian event, which we have every year. It's a novelist and essayist called Jessie Van Eerden. Jessie teaches at Hollins in the MFA program, and her novels and essays are really, really beautiful. And it would be, you will enjoy her immensely if you can come out and see Jessie. She'll be at King in the morning. We always have morning events on campus at 9:15, to which everyone is welcome. Evening events are always somewhere downtown. In the case of Jessie, that'll be at Emmanuel Episcopal Church at 7 p.m. Anything that requires no AV, we prioritize Emmanuel because you can't show slides there. So that's where we tend to move those events. We have been doing this since 2007, and it's something that we hope to continue in perpetuity, and I hope to see many of you at these events. If you want to get on our mailing list, you can talk to the person I am, apart from Jill, happiest is here, is Elizabeth Patrick, who is our new administrative person for the King Institute and for Chapel at King. Our former assistant was wonderful, but she had enough of me and Brian, I think, and she decided to go off to the high school. But if you want to give an email address to Elizabeth, we have an email list we'd love to put you on. Even better, go and like my Facebook page, because everything shows up on there. King Institute for Faith and Culture, and you can find all the announcements and the events in one convenient place. I've known Jill Baumgaertner since I was a sophomore in college, when I took 17th century English literature, a class that I went into with little knowledge and came out with lifelong friends, especially John Donne and George Herbert, poets who have meant a lot to me for many, many years, that were introduced to me in that class a couple of years back when I was a sophomore in college. Jill taught as professor of English at Wheaton College, my alma mater, for many, many years, and then took a leap that many do not have the bravery to do and became dean of Humanities and Theological Studies, a post which she held for 17 years. She's now retired, and also she spent a term as interim provost, which is even more crowns in heaven, I think, for doing a job like that. She has now, for many years, served as the poetry editor for the Christian Century magazine. And if you're familiar with Christian Century, you will have seen poems by Jill, and many that she has selected for a very long time. They're going to be collected in an anthology next March, and that book will be released in Chicago with a nice book release with a visit from Malcolm Guite, who many of you remember from our series last year. So she's a very accomplished poet. She's also written on Flannery O'Connor, so we do have 3 of her books at the back. Her book on Flannery O'Connor, A Proper Scaring, and 2 books of poetry, From Shade to Shine, which is our title tonight, and What Cannot Be Fixed. And those are available at the back from Steve. Jill may even sign it for a small extra fee if you want to get a signed copy of the book at the end. We are very happy to have her here. She has served as president of the Conference on Christianity and Literature as well. That's another, among other distinctions. She's been nominated for a Pushcart Prize. She's done all kinds of interesting things, and many of those will come out, I hope, in the poetry that follows. However, last time I saw Jill, she told me that she was exploring heroic couplets. And if you don't know the heroic couplet, it's a 2-line rhyming scheme that you can put at the end of a poem, or you can do the whole thing in heroic couplets. And I thought, in honor of the heroic couplets, I'm going to compose some heroic couplets in honor of Jill Baumgaertner. So, this is my first poetry reading in public. And I will say this is going to be the best introduction ever, because you're going to look good no matter what after this. So, in honor of Jill's visit, brace yourselves. My sophomore year at Wheaton College, thick with hair and short on knowledge, I signed up for a course in lit, about which I knew not a whit. And that was going to be a joke, because Whit should be here, but he's sick. So unfortunately, that blew that line totally. So, oh well. I entered class perplexed and quizzical. These poets were metaphysical. Donne and Herbert, Johnson, Marvel were soon singing and not garbled. Guiding us was our professor. Incomprehension now was lesser. She had us journal. Made us search, both reflections and research. Let me pause, and I know that's hard because you're really caught up in this, I can tell. But we had an assignment that was journaling, and Jill was very clear to us that the journal had to be half research and half reflection. I had students who were my fellow English majors who thought that just meant they could just write reflections. Well, that's what the next verse is. So she had us journal, made us search, both reflections and research. Some emoted every day. I researched, I got an A. Our kinship was, it seems, just starting. Her spouse and son were both called Martin. Incidentally, the first person I ever knew besides myself called Martin was Jill's son. Her poems do not booth her in. She's earthy and yet Lutheran. You try to rhyme something with you. She's kind and wise and always mannerly, not unlike her beloved Flannery. We're delighted she's in this good location to tell us all about vocation. That was this morning's poem. And now to hear her lovely poems and then take them to our homes. Because at the back, if you'll take a look, we're selling 3 of her fine books. With thanks to Central Press, our partner, please join me in welcoming Jill Baumgaertner.
That was the best introduction I've ever had. But it unfortunately reminds me of this cartoon that I cut out of the New Yorker that's over my desk. A little woman is standing behind a podium, and she says to the crowd in front of her, Before I begin my introduction, I'm going to read a little poem of my own. I have to admit that as an author, reading to a group has a great advantage over being read by individuals who can at any moment close the book. I imagine there are in this audience not only lovers of poetry, but maybe even some writers of poetry. My favorite bit of advice comes from Cynthia Ozick. Do any of you know Cynthia Ozick's work? She has been called the most moral voice in American literature. She's Jewish, she's from New York, and she writes like a dream. And this is what she says. I was taking a course with Lionel Trilling and wrote a paper for him with an opening sentence that contained a parenthesis. He returned the paper with a wounding reprimand. Never begin an essay with a parenthesis in the first sentence. Ever since then, I've made a point of starting out with a parenthesis in the first sentence. So, be bold, even defiant if you have to be. I was also recently reading Alexander Solzhenitsyn's massive novel, In the First Circle, which was the unexpurgated version of First Circle, in which certain technologically, scientifically skilled prisoners are kept in a special prison camp in which they had certain freedoms, not many actually, but some that other prisoners in prisons in the Gulag, like Lubyanka, did not have. Their technological savvy was useful to the Soviet government. What was considered dangerous was not their scientific knowledge. What was considered dangerous was a book of poems one of the prisoners had that was seized by one of the guards. So this is very dangerous activity, this poetry. So, this evening I want to give you a brief overview of my poetry, reading some very old ones and some very new ones. The first poem I'm going to read, you need to know this about my background. My father was Cuban, but he was also an American Air Force officer. We moved many times in his career. Have you ever been the new girl or new boy in school or in any place? I was that 16 times from 1st to 12th grade. And this poem is called, Where Are All My Lost Addresses? Those ghost dwellings, temporary, all of them. The Valdosta green shingles, the Madrid balcony, the Boston salt box, the Long Island cottage, how many others? The Missouri patio, the Air Base cracker boxes in Simbach, Sumter, Montgomery, assigned by rank, covered garages to colonels, carports to captains, parking spaces for NCOs. The addresses, all 20 or 25, clattering through my childhood like a box of puzzle pieces pulled down from a bookcase. Each one a potential link to another, each one a small snip of memory, disconnected. These places, where were they? The couch where I lay, my leg in a cast. The kitchen with the red-hot water light. The storage cubicle where we pulled my mother's costumes from the trunk. The brittle fronds of the grass skirt. The mothball redolence of the flamenco dress. Her tap shoes. Her ribboned ballet slippers. From that world that whirled her before our birth. Each time the green silk curtains unfolding their soft fluttering, the piano nicked in new places, always a box of books, Swiss Family Robinson, the biography of Clara Barton, lost with other toys. Each time unpacking the painting of the kneeling woman weaving, her husband standing over her like an intent buzzard. Each time the china cups gingerly unrolled from the packing paper and set inside the maple cabinet. Then the first day of school, 16 different times, the fear that tightened my throat, the potent odors of spaghetti or fish sticks in the waxed hallways, the first steps into the hushed classroom, staring, the tentative recess invitation from a classmate cornered by the teacher. This is what I thought was natural. The unaccustomed street corner at night, the spruce dropping cones, each a small thud on the roof outside my bedroom window, the stiffness of the new key in the lock. I wrote, this book is now out of print. It's called Finding Cuba, and it's really my first full-length collection. And I wrote it to try to imagine a solution to a family mystery, and that was why it was that my grandmother, Irish American, left her Cuban husband in Cuba and her children, and went off to New York to join Ziegfeld Follies. And so I tried to imagine what that relationship must have been like. This is, the 1910s. And this is what I came up with. It's pure imagination. My father read these poems before he died, and he said, I don't know, who would be interested in our story? So I think he was admitting there that maybe there might be some truth to it. This is called exogamy, which is marrying outside one's tribe. The attraction. At first, it was the accents he detected in her speech. The inflections filled and formed her vowels, lingered over her L's, crisped her consonants. For her, it was the contradictions, his black silk socks, his decisively knotted tie, his coffee plants, blooming snow clouds, lemon trees, the limes, pomegranates, the Mexican rose, the mignonette tree, Spain and Ireland, Cuba and America. The marriage would be filled with space and air, escape from ordinary time to festival. What he did not say, the work of Cuban señoras, a little sewing and embroidery, siesta, sunset drives, daily mass with chaperones. She had not considered the tiny feet of Cuban women, ornamental, evidence they never were allowed to tread the ground. In paper soles, he kept her. An image. On her steamship passage from New York, the death of a deckhand, the body sewn in his hammock, his feet weighted with iron, the service read for burial at sea, the corpse launched from a jury-rig grating, the water so calm the ship seemed anchored to the spot, the water so clear she could see the body descending slowly to the sandy floor. It bounced gently and then stood upright, its feet treading lightly the ground, wafted by gentle currents, walking the bottom of the sea, wrapped in its own bed. She would sit on the roof in the evening and breathe shallowly the breath of flowers, occasionally embroidering the veil for my aunt's first communion, twisting my father's curls when he pulled on her skirts and stood tottering before the inevitable collapse to the floor and his crawling patrol of the area that contained him. Her husband's sisters surrounded her, their children at their feet, everyone in white linen, gauze, silks. She thought she might die wrapped in such whiteness. His silences were absolute. He rolled them out like carpet and smothered her words before they formed. This was different from his early muteness, more ominous, like the silence between breaths, like waiting for the next that might not come. It's been a while since I've read that poem. It's pretty grim, isn't it? I end this section of the book with a poem called Pelias Relinked. My name is Jill Pelias Baumgaertner. But I had hidden it for years under the initial P. And it was a Cuban student, actually. It's one of the Colson scholars at Wheaton. The Colson scholars were people who had been in prison, and Chuck Colson they were under his tutelage, and he converted them, and then many of them came to Wheaton. Well, this one Cuban came by my office one day. We had talked before because he was Cuban, and I wanted to make some connections. And he looked at my name on the door, Jill P. Baumgaertner. He said, P. He said, that is such a white name. So in a way, he gave me permission to take my name back. And that's where my interest started also then in trying to recover, some stories from the past. So, Pelias Relinked. My name lopped off like an ear, I now stitch back carefully with this needle and invisible thread, tiny sutures, the seams only barely exposed. Underneath my hair, no one knew of the hole straight to my skull. No one knew of the way sound pierced that chamber, as narrow as a bullet, but losing fine modulations, its conch tunings mute. We are as flexible as the finely stitched bindings of books, those of us who have forfeited our names. Underneath a signature as heavy and dark as the Rhine, I have waited years to turn back into myself. It is this familiar set of syllables, as sheer as lawn. I raise it, fragile page, like a white flag. Among some of my travels in recent years was a most amazing trip to Poland. I have a friend, a very dear friend, who is a rabbi. I might even read one of his poems if we have time. And he's an Orthodox rabbi, and he gathered Jewish and Christian leaders in Chicago, and he took us to Poland, and we visited 6 concentration camps or sites of killing fields in 5 days. This poem is called Mobile Killing Units, Lopaczowa Forest, Poland. And it was one of the sites we had to walk through a forest to get to it. And it was one of the sites where an entire village was taken to a pit and shot. And then they were thrown into the pit and buried there. The hush in the forest is calming at first and then not. No songs to sing along this Via Dolorosa except Kaddish. I walk on pine needles decades after thousands were herded like animals to the pit that is just ahead. The silent whispers of the dead linger, caught even in the branches of these straight pines, still sloughing, still seeping into the soil. Yes, Baumgaertner is written in the death rolls at Auschwitz. Pelias in the archive of victims and survivors. This is not my story, each name a bloodline, each silenced voice, words unlinked from mine. This is not my story, yet I, a Jew of the New Testament, am stumbling along, my year-old child clinging to my neck. For a flash of a second, I am aware of one sharp breath and the beginning of a fall into the abyss. This is not my story, I keep repeating. This is not my story. Occasionally at Wheaton, I would be asked to write a poem for an occasion, occasional poetry. And this request came 2 weeks before an event That is not a lot of time to write a poem, although, Martin, I imagine you could do it.
I spent weeks on that.
And I was told that it needed to be a poem that captures November, but that also leads to a point where the choir can then begin to sing. Foolishly, I said, yes, I do it. And, but this is the poem that resulted. It has an epigraph, Ephesians 5:8-20. The relevant verses are, sleeper, awake, rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. Many trees are mere stencils now, but some still dazzle, those with light in their yellow leaves, this even as November skies stretch mute and somber. It is easy this time of year to dwell on losses, and the world so shattered, even watching this translucent yellow tree whose light one could read by, this blaze against the dimming season. And we are gathered, each one of us, in this autumn dilemma, both anchored and adrift. Like Eve, reaching for Adam's hand as they stand, stunned, outside the gates. Or that child Mary, who in the silence after Gabriel's startling news wonders, should I say yes? Or Paul, the persecutor, eyes scaled, his mouth a thin straight line, his heart in its first ever motion of turning over. Or 2,000 years later, those rabbis at Auschwitz who put God on trial, convicted him, then turned to evening prayer. Or the aging professor who said that when he cannot forgive, he simply acts as if he had. These images may seem splinters, fragments scattered and aimless, but we are not so twisted that we cannot see the crosses change from torture into bliss, from blood and slivers into the gleam of polished planks for Christ, arms raised in victory. So here we gather in all of our imperfections, waiting for song to blaze into the dark corners as this year races toward both finales and preludes. Listen, soon one clear voice will blend with another. Anchored by the rush of melody, we will catch hold of the whole breath and timbre of the moment, and together, in this world so prone to drift, we will see by the cross the tree of light, pure music. This one is a pretty new one. I was asked to write a poem for an anthology that's coming out next year. An anthology published by the Chrysostom Society, which is a group of Christian writers. And they wanted me to write a poem to go in the section called Jesus in Us. This doesn't sound very Lutheran to me. But I began to think about it, and I realized that one of my favorite lines in John Donne's poems is a line in which he's talking about Jesus in Mary. And he says, immensity cloistered in thy dear womb. Immensity cloistered in thy dear womb. And I thought, well, I can write about that. And there are two afters here. The poem is called After the Annunciation. The one after is about Jesus in the womb, and the other is about Jesus as he brings us to life. After the Annunciation. He tumbles, toeing the walls of his captivity, hears her muffled chatter, tastes the fog of the sweet foods she eats, is startled by the noise of saw on wood, the pounding of nails. The amniotic fluid in his throat teaches him to swallow. Much later, he learns pain as his neurons begin to fire. This was before. laughter, he upends us as he somersaults our vision. Our words, yes, he as word, words us. We taste the savor of the bread, the spice of wine, his lifeblood coursing our heart's chambers. He is pulse-born, he is pulse-born. His spirit muscles us, he lunges for our breath. He is where we are. He feels the lilts of our delights, the blazes of our sufferings. Fresh as new skin, taut as nerve strings, he drums and whistles us, our beat, our melody. Our bodies know his gifts, our everlasting bodies. I had a friend, her name was Anya Silver. She's one of the finest poets, contemporary poets I know. She wrote a lot of poems, and she died at the age of 49 of metastatic breast cancer, which she had had for 14 years. And she discovered that she had this cancer when she was pregnant with her one and only child, Noah. And Anya, she kept giving poetry readings. And in one, I had her come and read to a group, and she talked about how her favorite holiday, church holiday, or church observance was Ash Wednesday. And this poem is about that. It's also, there's a reference at the end to another John Donne reference. In his final sermon that he preached, he talked about people sitting in the pews, breathing in the dust of their ancestors. Ash Wednesday, in memoriam, Anya Silver. We chose not to see how close it hovered. She had been sick so long we had grown accustomed to her bright scarves and turbans as she sipped her drink across the table or read her poems behind the podium, such shaking, such delicacy. She told the poets gathered that her favorite season was Lent. It is a great comfort, she said, ashes to ashes, a reminder that everyone, each in their chosen pew, is dying. And now her taped voice, only atoms and a magnetic field. Her face a flicker of light and dark on film, except her poems, where words have the resonance of absence. Even buried, bones live, motionless for many more years than the body has breath. And so her words and the crumbling to ash, soot and oil on the pastor's fingers. Sitting in our pews, we breathe in the dissolution, John Donne says, of royalty and pauper, their mouths filled with dust, our mouths filled with their dust. I was asked to write poems on the 5 solas. These are the 5 solas from the Reformation: sola being alone, grace alone, faith alone, scripture alone, Christ alone, the glory of God alone. And of course, they're not alone, they're all describing each other. So I'm going to read a couple of poems from that series. This first one is Sola Fide, Faith Alone. And it's the story really of my brother-in-law who had a sailing accident and was drowned. This was a few years ago. It's still pretty fresh. He was someone who was filled with doubt, even though he was from a family of strong Presbyterian faith. But he was filled with doubt. And I remember one day he asked me, he said, "Jill, do you think we have to believe in the resurrection to be Christian?" And yet at the same time, he acted on what he knew of his faith. He went to prisons. He converted prisoners. And so this is called Sola Fide. In the pitiless rooms, stark with guilt and stiff with miseries, he brings thieves to Jesus and teaches them to pray. He who doubts everything reads Romans with convicts. 2 weeks before he dies, he lists his deeds for thee. Widows, orphans, felons. He visits them. His eyes brim with interrogation. He believes, he says without speaking, that he does not believe. How much does God desire, I wonder, outside of actions and intentions, outside of struggle and defiance? In the deed, the spark of faith, a flash, denying his pronouncements, his doubts, his denials, a particle, a fleck, a crumb's worth. It is sufficient. And this poem, Soli Deo Gloria, only to God be the glory, which is what Bach wrote on every single one of his compositions. I had a dear friend, a very close friend. Carl Schock was a composer, church choral music primarily, a lot of Lutheran liturgy. And he was a collaborator. He and I worked together for many years, and he was such a good friend that he and his wife and my husband and I traveled the world together. For many years, we went everywhere. And in his last years, he suffered from macular degeneration, which in his case, I don't know if this is every case, but the center of his vision, he didn't have anymore. He could only see around the edges. Can you imagine a composer trying to compose like that? Anyway, this is Soli Deo Gloria for Carl Schock. The composer's vision lacks centers, he says. The music he writes must fit into his peripheries. Even so, God's glory dazzles the scores like an ocean's pageantry of light. What he cannot see, he hears. And now in the back seat of my car, as we travel to churches of his early ministry, find organs he once played and choir lofts filled with ghosts of voices he schooled, he quotes Milton, "When I consider how my life is spent." He has its music already in his head. We cannot fix our gaze and see it all through close scrutiny in full light. We must catch it in a sideways glance, tilt into it, and snatch it at an angle. Otherwise, we are blind to it, too dazed by this world to take it in. We work with these few images and music heard only by those whose vision is too dim to see. God's glory is rampant and stretches us to heaven. Our reach is short. Our toes grip earth, but we have glimpsed reality and heard its music. Are there any dog lovers here? We are, in my family, dog crazy. All of my dogs have learned to sneeze on command. My last two, well, we have two little rat terriers now. Our two dogs before that were named Luther and Katie, for cat Luther and his wife, Katerina von Bora. And Luther would fall into a dead dog pose whenever we said Martin Luther's last words to him. Anyway, so this was not about Luther, this is about Maddie, and this is an elegy for a bull terrier. A bull terrier is that target dog. This was after Christopher Smart's Rejoice in the Lamb, a song from Bedlam, in which he writes a poem about his cat, Jeffrey. So for you cat lovers out there, there's, that's under the surface. For I will consider my dog Maddie, for she meditated at the back door, waiting for the crunch of tires on leaves, watching the play of shadows and branches. For she worshipped on the living room carpet's patch of sun. For she stretched out in cool prayer on the wooden floor of the porch in hot weather. For in her muscled youth, she chased the demon possum from the hedge. For she loved the spirit of wind in her face when she put her head into it. For she ate the occasional ant that strayed close to her bed. For she curled into a fetus of fur when she slept. For she sneezed on command. Thou Maddie of the slack lips, the smooth flank, the vicious appeal of the serrated gums, of the great jaws dripping water lapped, or locking around the bone, or holding the toy cat gently in the cradle of thy mouth. Thou Maddie of ears pricked as if dipped in starch. Thou Maddie with paws thick as turf. Thou my dog forever and I, baptized by my daughter in the waters of the bathroom sink. In thy bath, thy most primitive self on display, in pink skin under thin fur. Thou, the beast in my kitchen, thy great sides heaving with sleep as thou lay in front of the roast-filled oven. Thou dog, cur, thou canine tyke, thou puppy, thou only and ever after, thou rich dogness mingled with devotion. Thou then in your life's fast last moments smiled thy teeth on the pleasures of thy bowl and gave a benediction to thy favorite snack of crusts. We raise our glasses to thee, noble beast, and say, good dog, thou godly inversion, thou sheer hound. This next poem is an older one. It's one of my favorites. It's called Genesis, and I'm trying to imagine the creation of language in Adam's naming of the animals. And he knows one thing about language, but Eve knows a whole lot more. And Adam rises from the mud whole, moving his feet slowly through the clay as it sucks and pulls him back, not yet ready to give him up. His legs move like shears cutting leather, and then he stands as still as stone, exhaling what God has breathed into him, the mud drying on his arms, as he watches himself and wonders where he was before these arms were his, these legs, this mud, and each finger's evidence of particularity. Had he been there always, stirring the mind of God, waiting for the mandate to rise from his mesh of images to conform to flesh? Adam stands, warming, thinking his way into the world. He is the only one, symmetrical, sufficient, the crux of matter, the focal point. What does breathing have to do with it, he wants to know, and he begins to think. Fox, lynx, otter, missel thrush, marmoset. Words without context, names he mouths as fast as they come to him. Fairy shrimp, lark, tamarin, sturgeon. His respiration fills with utterance, his mind with images of skunk, pigeon, ibex, wallaby. Trapped in the rhythms of naming, he seeks the spaces between syllables, desires respite from the phonics tumble. The words roll unthroats him, makes him listen for inflections to meet his in more than an echo. He leans back into the cumulus of grass and dreams images of hair, eyes, skin, thinks when he awakens that his dreams have made her up. Eve knows she has been there always, kindling his mind, teasing the hairs on his arm. She says, skitter, punt, hedge, fleece, speckle. That words are acts had not occurred to him. She says, jostle, dice, pepper, twine. When she says stick, pedal, march, he is stirred to reciprocity, sensing rationale, antecedent, cogitation. Eve gazes at the fading sunlight and sees God above and through. Adam sees the dust on fire with twilight. His fingers seek hers. She raises his palm and with her finger spells her love inside it. He moves close for her interpretation. The next poem is based on Matthew 19 when Christ invites the children, says to his disciples, do not keep the children from me. I'm going to read it, and I'm going to say a few words about it, and then I'm going to read a poem that was written in response to it. It's called Let Them. He names them Samuel, Isaac, Mary, all of the anonymous daughters of Jephthah, the infant of Bathsheba, and those 42 children who laughed at bald Elisha and were torn limb from limb. Let them come. Let them push their small shoulders into the crowd of Rachel's children. Let the holy innocents stand so close they can see the beating pulse of his temple. Let them come. All of those with tiny wrists, small ankles, pudgy or thin arms, round bellies from feast or famine. Let them feel the breath of God on their precarious necks. Let the armless child from Iraq rest on his knee. Let the Vietnamese girl with burning skin remember his cool fingers. Let them come. Do not hinder them. Smooth the path. Clear the way for him to feel the press of them, the warmth of their perilous bodies next to his. So I handed this poem, after I'd worked on it, I handed it to my husband and he said, do you really mean perilous bodies or do you mean imperiled bodies? And I said, no, I mean perilous bodies because I think they're probably dangerous. And it wasn't until my friend, Rabbi Pupko, read this poem that I began to understand. He said, Jill, you've written a blasphemous poem. I said, well, I didn't intend to. And he said, no, it's blasphemous because these perilous bodies, they're dangerous because what you're doing here is you are questioning the justice of God. And so he wrote this poem in response. Let me find it here. This is his first book of poems called What is Lost. And this is called Suffer the Little Children. To the ghettos, Warsaw, Vilna, Lodz, Lublin. Then little children were brought to Jesus, Sarah, Rebecca, Leah, Rachel, for him to place his hands on them and pray for them. Abraham, Yitzhak, Yaakov, Yosef. But the disciples rebuked those who brought them, Miriam, Yocheved, Zipporah, Elisheva. Jesus said, let the little Barak, Gideon, Shimshon, Shmuel, children come to me, Issachar, Zebulun, Gad, Asher, and do not hinder them, Tirzah, Bathsheba, Hannah, Penina, for the kingdom of heaven, Auschwitz, Treblinka, Madianek, Sobibor, belongs to such as these. Shlomo, Hitzkiyahu, Yeshahayu, Yirmiyahu. When he had placed his hands on them, Yentl, Sosha, Mindali, Springsa, he went on from there. Belzec, Jelma, Platza, Buchenwald, and the little children came. find that one of the most devastating poems I've ever read in response to my poem. I'm going to read one more. This is actually the last poem in my new book, From Shade to Shine. I went to the Orkney Islands with Carl Schock, the composer. He had been there 4 times. He loved the Orkney Islands. And when he was 90, we put together a trip, taking his daughter, and he said to me, okay, your assignment this time is to write poems about all the places we visit, and then I'm going to set those poems to music. That was quite a vacation I took. So this is the last poem in the series. It's called Compline. They're arranged according to the liturgical hours. This is 9 p.m. And this one is Ring of Brodgar and Standing Stones. There are standing stones all over the Orkneys, but in particular this Ring of Brodgar that's like the ones in England.
Stonehenge.
Yes, Stonehenge, thank you. And what he did was I wrote all these poems, and then he took the last few lines of each one and set them to music. So, and then I was able, in this wonderful publisher, Paraclete Press, I was able then to end the collection with a prayer. I can't imagine another publisher letting me do that with poetry. So, Ring of Brodgar and Standing Stones. The ring of stone towers, flat rocks, marks the earth with mystery. Their makers, their movers gone, the only traces, the cairns, the brochs, and tools of stone and bone. But we know, seeing the ring's skyward reach, that they too felt slight next to the Almighty. We kneel our God in front of majesty, our posture both chosen and helpless, sin stunted. Your glory, our only wealth, your Son, our only Son. Praise to the God who rounds the days, the seasons, praise, fullness, time completed and begun again, that we may know you now and also then, in life so firmly anchored in the mud of earth, but reaching toward the light so real, we feel its glance upon our skin. And then the prayer, Almighty God, in shadowy places your radiance sets fire to night, and darkness becomes light. Make us a steady sheen, reflecting the glory of our Lord Jesus Christ. Thank you.
We do have time for some conversation, questions, discussion, and I have a mic. So anything you want to ask, comment? You can ask about my poetry too. I just want to point that out. It's, you may want to delve into its riches as well. But any questions, comments for Joe?
Well, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for all these problems tonight.
It's good to have, and it's good to have an audience. You know, you don't. A poet doesn't necessarily have a sense of an audience, you know. And it's so good to see people who are actually listening to words. And so, thank you.
I don't know if I need that. Just want
Yeah,
to.
sure.
Okay. You just, with your last poem and your trips to the Orkney Islands, what is it about those islands that pulls you? I've never been. I don't know much about them at all.
It's such, you know, it's a windswept landscape. There are hardly any trees, but there's lots of green grass, and I don't know, the artifacts that are left from life 5,000 years ago. it just makes you feel like you're connecting with something that we don't get a chance to connect with in this country. History and in a way, life eternal. It's a very mysterious place, and Carl Schott going there 4 times. That's quite a trip to get up there, you know? It's northern Scotland, yeah.
I just thought all of your poetry was beautiful, and your early life experience kind of resonated with me, because I went to probably 12 or 13 different schools. You know, my father was not military, but we moved around a lot. He was from the north, my mother was from the south, and but also the you know, it was just so touching and poignant when you were talking about the Poland experience, because my husband,
Yeah.
we went on a similar trip.
Yeah. Yes. Well, thank you for that. Thank you for expressing that and for connecting with those poems. I don't run into very many people who have been to 12 or 13 schools. I have a psychologist friend who said, "Jill, this explains a lot." So, but yeah, and the travel with someone you love, it's really, yeah, you got that forever in your memory. Yeah.
On one of those trips, there were two sisters whose father had been in Auschwitz, and he had died like the year before, but they made the trip. They wanted to make the trip with him, but they went on a private tour and saw where their father was imprisoned, and saw names that they recognized that were written on the walls. I mean, it was just incredible. It was just so, you know, you just can't imagine experiencing something like that.
You know, the first poem I ever wrote, I was 16, and we were living in Germany at the time, and we went to visit Dachau. And I was horrified, of course. I mean, I'd never thought about this, even in my wildest nightmares. And there I was confronted with it, but I was also horrified because at that time, they didn't know if they were going to tear those barracks down and make a beautiful memorial there, or if they're going to leave them. And I was just outraged that they'd tear them down, because that is the reminder of what the reality was.
It's holy grail.
Sacred.
Yeah, it is sacred. Yeah.
There are so many stories, you know, with a husband who was in charge of pushing the bodies into the furnace, and he actually saw his son and wife, and, you know, you just can't imagine
Yes.
the horror of that.
Yeah.
But thank you.
I have a question. You read wonderfully when you read the poetry, and not all poets do this. For those of us who have ever tried listening to T.S. Eliot reading his own poetry, it's like on TikTok or other platforms where you get the fake voice, and you think that's about as lively as Eliot gets.
Yes.
Or on the other hand, you get Dylan Thomas, where it's this sort of bizarre, overdone thing. I'm curious how you do. Do you practice? Is it in your head when you're writing? Can you hear how it's going to sound? When you read it, how do you get the reading down? Because it's so natural. It's so easy to follow.
I tell you what is foremost in my mind when I'm writing or when I'm reading is communicating with either readers or an audience. And I have been to so many poetry readings that were just so dull, not because the poetry was bad, but because the reader couldn't wasn't interested in communicating. Plus, these days, I could go on a tirade now. A lot of poetry is being written that doesn't communicate at all with an audience. It's extremely narcissistic, and it's being published in all the best places too. And it's very discouraging. Yeah. Let's not end on that note.
Well, I see that you feel everything that you're saying, and as if you're rewriting it when you're up there reading. And it's so beautiful to see you almost read it as it's fresh and new off of your lips and out of your heart. And it's so beautiful to see you do that.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate that.
And I particularly was touched by everything, but particularly your in the womb and after the womb poem of Jesus. That was quite, how can I say it, insightful and lovely. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I've been in trouble lately with my sister because I've started writing about our childhood. And she unfriended me on Facebook. Because in one of my poems, I'm referring to her as a 5-year-old, and I called her a needling imp. Anyway, I've got a relationship to repair, but that poetry can do that too. Well, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You can continue to sit in stunned silence. We're finished up. Do remember us on September 12th for Jesse Van Earden. Please join me in thanking Jill Baumgaertner. Oh, also, books. You have heard these fine poems. Wouldn't it be great to have them on paper with her signature? You have that opportunity. Steve is in the back with 3 of her titles. Please do feel free to go get a book or 2. I'll send you back that way. And if you want to pick up a book or 2, please do. We take cards, we take cash. We take promissory notes, just about anything, so please do. And join us again on September 12th. Please join me again in thanking Jill Baumgaertner.